So I had to like research the types of weapons that were used by different factions in the Star Wars universe. And the Blast Tech Corporation was making weapons for the Rebels and the Empire and the New Republic, and they are making so much money. These companies are selling to everybody. So they really are evil. And that's what you start to learn if you take the time to read up about fictional companies in a fictional universe.
Well, hello there, comic book friends. My name is Jordan Clays, your host of Comic Converse, here for a very special episode with my next guest, Fearless Fred Kennedy. Now, a true Renaissance man is a hard thing to come by these days, but my next guest on Comic Converse is all that and more. Fearless Fred is the co-founder of Big Sexy Comics and the creator of beloved comic titles such as Teuton and Helos. He became a household name in Canadian radio broadcasting channels thanks to his tenure on Toronto's iconic rock station, 102.1 The Edge, and now commands his own show on Q107. And as if that weren't enough, Fred is also the creator of his own Star Wars audio drama, Mud 79, the second season of which is rumored to be released later this year. He's an avid fitness enthusiast, a not-so-closeted horticulturalist, and today he joins me to talk about his forthcoming comic book, Dead Romans, drawn by Nick Marinkovich and published by Image Comics, which is due to be released this coming March. Fred, it is a privilege to be speaking with you today.
It's great to be here, man. It's great. Like, it was funny when you say Renaissance man. Like, the thing about the fitness and the gardening and whatnot is that's just all from my brain. Like, that's like my mental health therapy stuff. Like, I'm serious when I say that gardening is a spiritual experience. Like, when they talk about the hobbits and Lord of the Rings and their love of gardening, totally get it. 100% get it. There's just something magical about watching plants grow out of the soil. Like, it's a really cool experience. Like, I think everybody should try and garden, even if it's just like on windowsill garden, anything. It's so easy to do. People have this idea it's very cost prohibitive, but you can buy a bag of soil, throw it on your patio, like on your balcony in your apartment, cut a hole in it, throw some tomato seeds. In a few weeks, you got a whole bunch of tomatoes. It's super easy to do. There you go.
Well, you know what? Because we're definitely going to get to the gardening a little bit later on. So I'm jazzed to hear you say that, because I've actually got a bunch of things that I want to pick your brain about. But I figure to kick things off, the reason why we're here, it makes the most sense to talk about Dead Romans. So, just straight from the horse's mouth here, in Dead Romans, lush, beautiful illustrations bring to life a brutal tale of love and war from the birth of the Roman Empire. Arminius wants to make a queen of the woman he loves, Honoria, a fellow slave. And now 50,000 Romans will die to give her a throne she never asked for or wanted. I gotta say, that just goosebumps, just incredible stuff. So first off, congratulations to you. This is incredibly exciting stuff. Your first, Image book. I guess it makes the most sense to ask, where did the inspiration for Dead Romans come from? How did this kind of come to be?
Well, I love Roman history. And we moved to Canada from Belgium when I was 12. And so the part of Belgium that we grew up in, there was there's all kinds of Roman historical sites everywhere in Europe. Like, the fingerprints are still there. And the part of Belgium that we grew up in, there was a village that was recreated of the Belgii clan, who were mentioned repeatedly in the Gallic Wars memoirs from Julius Caesar as being, they're very dangerous. They didn't allow themselves to get taken prisoner. They would kill their own before the Romans arrived. They were pretty brutal people. We saw these villages when I was a kid. And then, of course, Belgium's got a very strong comic book community with Lucky Luke, the Les Schtroumpfs, the Smurfs, and, of course, Asterix and all that stuff. And reading Asterix comics and reading about the Romans. And there's a lot of historical stuff in those comics that people don't realize. And so when you live in a place like Europe, there is that history that is everywhere all the time. And we lived in this village called Erchy, where a castle was founded by Clovis, who was the grandfather of Charlemagne. So, like, I love that historical stuff. And I'd always wanted to do a story about Rome. And right when COVID hit and the big pencils down Remember that kind of a big lightning bolt through the comic book community. I had 3 projects that were in the process of going to contract.
Yep, most
right
definitely.
then. 3, and all of them imploded, and it was really frustrating. And I'd sort of like put comics on the back burner while I focused on the radio play, which you mentioned. And I was just about finished the final episode, getting ready to drop it. And Nick, who I'd been talking to before, and just sort of like, when you can get to this pitch, get to it. Don't put any super crazy effort into it because the pencils down incident, we don't know what's happening. And then he sent me the pitch. And when I got it, I was like, oh my God, it's so good. So I sent it out, and Jim Valentino and Shadowline got back to us right away. And so that's it. I didn't expect anything to happen. I was just in such a negative headspace. And I'd been doing comics like forever, and I kind of just like said, I'm done with it, because I'd had so many almosts, so many. And then when I finally felt like I'd had things happening, and COVID hit, and it like took all of that effort and time and money away, I was really dejected. And when Dead Romans happened, it was very unexpected. But I'm really excited about it, because the story of Teutoburg Forest, anybody who's ever read about history, the Battle of Teutoburg Forest is one of the most culturally important things to ever happen, with like repercussions that are still affected today. Like there's the Germanic Romanic language line in Europe, which is directly resulting from the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. So that was like the goal of telling a story that involves Teutoburg without actually hinging on the events of the battle, was the big focus.
No, and I think that that's absolutely awesome, because I mean, I think that's something that maybe some people won't realize right off the hop, is that, this is a work of historical fiction, but it is also something that really happened as well. And I mean, there's certainly, a lot of well-known kind of historical Roman rebels or barbarians. You've got Spartacus, Hannibal, Attila the Hun, kind of, that everyone kind of is familiar with. But I don't think that many people actually know the story of Arminius and sort of what he was able to do to the Roman legions. So I was really kind of stoked when I saw that kind of come across my desk.
I love Arminius as an historical figure and an historical character. And there's a big statue of Arminius in southern Germany, because he became like a really big symbol of Germanic pride, like in the whole, the Weimar Republic era. And there was like this reignition of the Germanic peoples, and Otto von Bismarck and all that stuff. And what makes Arminius fascinating to me is that he was created by Rome. Like, he was a child who was a Germanic prince who was taken as a child as a hostage back to Rome. And he was raised as a Roman noble. They trained him in the arts of war. He became, and then like some people went through that same process, but didn't really get it. He got it. And he became respected and feared amongst the Romans. They loved him because he was such a good general. He was never afraid. He never retreated. And he turned the tides of multiple battles from the Pannonian rebellions. And so when he went to Germania, when he went back, and Germania is in the process of becoming an actual Roman province, and he saw what was happening to his countrymen, and he remembered. Now, there's all kinds of different versions of what happened when he was a child, that his father made him swear that he would destroy Rome, which is oddly identical to what Hannibal's dad did to him. So whether that happened or not, we don't know. But the end result is he goes back to Germany, and he sees his countrymen being like crucified for not paying taxes. And the Germanic peoples at that time didn't understand the concepts of taxing, because they thought taxes were theft. So when the Romans came and demanded tribute and demanded taxes so that they could build roads, bridges, establish big cities and all these things, they didn't understand, why are they giving money to these people? Like, why are they doing it? So they wouldn't pay, and then they'd get crucified, or they get enslaved, or they get captured, or they get killed. And he just saw this repeatedly happening all the time. And then over 2 years, unites all these tribes, builds up this massive army, stages a trap that is masterfully executed. And it takes more than 2 years for his plans to culminate, you know? And that whole time he's playing two sides. I think he's one of the most fascinating characters in classical history. And it really does surprise me at how so many people know the name Attila the Hun, and so many people know the name Hannibal Barca. But when you say Arminius, they're like, who? They don't get it. Even if you say Herman the German, which is like Hermanus is another name that he is referred to. Herman the German is like the name that my dad always used. And it was like, nobody knows who he is, it's disappointing, because there's so many people that have this like knee-jerk fast reaction. They lead a revolt, and then it fizzles away, like Boudica. Becky Cloonan, one of my favorite artists, and I think her Conan is brilliant, and she takes a lot of heat because of the way she drew Conan, but I love her Conan. She's always said she wanted to do like a massive graphic novel about Boudica, who is another great tribal figure from Britain who united the British tribes and got annihilated by Rome, because it was like this fast, let's get together, let's start a rebellion right now. Arminius understood how Rome operated, and his mentality was, we can beat them in a few battles, but if we want them to go away and never come back, this is what we need to do. And that's what he does. And I'm not going to give too much away about the way it all happens, because it's in the book. You could also read a book about it too. But our story, I think, is really like Battle of Teutoburg adjacent, because the battle is really just a backdrop for the love story between Arminius and Honoria. So, yeah, I don't want to give too much away.
Mm-hmm. No, and I honestly that really feeds in perfectly to my next question, because I know in the interview that I read, you had mentioned that while this is, you know, a brutal and bloody and violent book, at its core, it is still very much a love story, and that it was important for you to find an artist who was able to capture that and kind of rectify it with those more violent and brutal elements. So how did kind of Nick Marinkovich come into the fold, and how kind of were you two able to kind of bounce ideas off one another?
Oh, I was terrified of Nick. Just so we'll start that off with, I was terrified to talk to him, because he's really good. He's really, really good. And I was batting this idea around for a while, like years before I ever did anything with it. And it was Kalman Andruszowski who dumped on me for being too afraid to go to Nick. And he's like, I'm telling you that as an artist, when someone comes to me and they're super passionate about their story, it adds to the pitch. It adds to them. And Nick loves Rome. Like, he loves, and he was explaining to me that artists love Rome because of how iconic all of the imagery is. Everything is designed to look powerful and imperialistic, for lack of a better term. Like, it's really over the top stuff, and it looks awesome when it's on the page. And the thing about the setting is the Teutoburg forest was a big, dark, ancient woodland, and the Romans were afraid of it because they thought it was filled with evil spirits, which is another thing that Arminius was aware of, and that's another reason that they were there. He did everything to throw them off edge. And it's this dark, ancient forests, and they're moving through flooded wetlands and bogs. And it's constant natural horror. It is all of the things that your brain instinctively says, this is bad, this is scary. And so you've got all this violence and horror imagery, but like we said, at the core, it's really about this guy trying to find the woman he loves, and the woman he loves trying to find him, while coming to grips with this whole horrible situation was caused by this guy that she was totally in love with, and who to her, despite her best judgments, fully has faith in and believes. And there's a great, I remember when I was in high school, we had to do this project in English about love and about the concepts of love and the way there are different types of love and how people behave differently when they're under the influence of romantic intent. And there is no doubt in my mind that Arminius's character is in love completely, totally, would do anything for Honoria, because everything that he's doing is for her, or at least he's convinced himself it's for her. But as we get older as people, we start to realize that the big romantic gestures, be it buying a car on Christmas morning or, butchering 50,000 Romans, that's not what wins. It's the listening, being attentive, being a good partner, and having open channels of communication that creates an effective relationship. And when Nick and I were discussing the story and the motivations, and I really got to give a big shout out to our editor, Allison O'Toole, who really helped us articulate some of the elements that we were working with in the story proper and in the pages and in the panels. And so we've got all this darkness, but at the same time, the characters are always very loving, and there's these big romantic, flurries and flourishes, I should say, in the story. And that's all Nick's art. Like, he has this great way of having one page that is, you can feel the oppressive horror elements in the environment, but you turn the page and we're in this very warm, romantic place that these two characters have created for themselves with their emotions. And the art really reflects that. And I was terrified about the art because it's so easy for it to always look cold, dark, dreary, and terrifying. But Nick really found a way of balancing everything together. I am so stoked for the pages that nobody has seen that are coming, because it's awesome. It's everything that I love about comics. It's fantastic.
Well, I mean, we're certainly excited to see them, and I think for as excited as you are to have Nick on board, he certainly seems equally as excited to be creating alongside with you as well. I saw a quote that he kind of had where he basically says, "Fred's a time traveler. He's taking us back to a moment in time and immersing us in the raw battle scars that went with it." And I guess I wanted to ask you, I mean, just in the few minutes that we've been talking, it's very clear that you're knowledgeable on this subject. I feel like, you could teach a course on this stuff. But I guess
I would
one of the
love
things
to.
that I would imagine would be, yeah. But I guess I wanted to ask you, what would you say is one of the most challenging aspects of rectifying that real world history with fictional comic book storytelling?
Um, there's this guy, uh, Con Eagleton, who is he's a British writer, and he writes a lot of historical fiction. And um, I was reading an interview with him once, and he was talking about this series of novels that he wrote about the War of the Roses. And he said the hardest thing to do when you're writing historical fiction is when you're going through the research phase and not falling into rabbit hole after rabbit hole of incredibly fascinating stories that don't necessarily service the plot or the story that you're telling. And this, if I could have done anything, like if Jim had said, "Listen, you do as much as you want to do, kid. We'll give you as many pages," I could have done like a 500-page story, like the story about his childhood, about him being raised in Rome and then going back to Germania, and the step-by-step process of his realization he needs to do something about the the Roman occupation of Germania, and how would he do it? What battle experience and tactical experience would he draw on? Who would he gather with him as his friends and allies? Because one thing that people don't realize, and if we do the second arc, this character will be involved. Arminius had a brother, and Arminius had a brother who lost an eye fighting in the uprising in the Teutoburg, but he lost and he was fighting for the Romans. Arminius' own brother didn't join his rebellion. And it's like, it's a fascinating breakdown because his brother ended up becoming a key component in Germanicus's attempted efforts to destroy the German rebellion. And that was an interesting thing that I couldn't touch on, but we have his brother in the pages. There are pages where you'll see his brother when they're children and how they develop, but we don't grow that character. And Honoria's character is so fascinating. She's my favorite character. Her and Regulus were my favorite characters to work with. Ippo, who is a character, Regulus and Ippo become big players in the second issue, where, because I don't know, because you've read the first issue as a preview edition, and in the first issue, it's very Arminius focused. It's very Arminius focused.
Yep.
The second issue is very Honoria focused, and it's more about her journey. And then we kind of go back and forth between the two of them because it's the two of them tell the story together. And Honoria's character, I took a look at the governor, Gaius Quintilius Varus, who is the governor of Germania, who hand-selected Arminius to be his right-hand man because he had a reputation of being able to go into areas that were trouble and quelling rebellion and bringing order back to a chaotic situation. And he was very smart and very good at it and very brutal. And then again, people tend to be, from a historical standpoint, as brutal as they need to be in the situation that they're in. And when he went to Syria, Syria was a Roman province that was like undergoing its own bit of calamity. And when he went there, he quelled a bunch of rebellions, and he did it in a very brutal, very Roman way. And so his legion was in Africa. And his legion being in Africa is where he has his first encounter with this Cushite gladiator who ends up being purchased by the Romans because they need to fill the ranks in battles that they were fighting in Egypt with rebellious Egyptian factions. And then from there, he went to Syria. And when he went to Syria, he overtook the former governor's home, which was on a vineyard. So there's all these things get mentioned in the story. All of these things are true. Like, I had to do the backdrop. And so Honoria's character is Syrian. And Syria, when the Romans came, was Greek. It was a Hellenic province because when Alexander the Great went through, it wasn't just an army. There was a whole cavalcade of civilians and camp followers and merchants and governors and political people that came in behind him to set up these dynastic kingdoms, the Seleucid dynasty and all that stuff. And so Honoria is Syrian, but she's also Greek. And there's times when, this was the thing that we kept getting caught with, everybody in those days, even if they didn't believe, they used religious swears. Like, that religion was a huge thing. And so there was there's something that's going to happen. I think it's in issue 3 where Honoria says something about a specific god. And then we went back. Is this god, what would this god be? Can't be Roman because she's not Romanic. Her religious beliefs would be Hellenic. So is it Hellenic or is it Syrian? And if it's Syrian, does that go back to like Babylonian worship? So then we had to like figure out, given the time when she was there, what are the gods that she would be worshiping at the time? And that was the funnest but best part. And so Honoria's character is this Hellenic slave girl who stops an attempted assassination of one of Varus's children. And because of her fearlessness and her loyalty, she is made frumentarii. And the Romans all had agents. They were always spying on each other. And they understood completely that the honeypot will get you information and get you results. And so someone like Honoria was used to woo, seduce, spy, and murder. And people like her, the frumentarii, the agents, they were always kept very close in the household, and they were always very looked after. And so on paper, she is a slave, but she has more power and pull than most nobility would, just because she is the hand selected assassin of the governor of the newest and biggest Roman province. So she's a very important character. And it's wild to me how some characters they don't even know what she is. But then you've got a guy like Regulus, who is one of the household guard, and immediately is like, no, you don't mess with her. She knows more about what's going on than any of us. So keep your mouth shut. She's the brains of the operation. So I really love those two characters because she is so tactical and brilliant and slow. Like when I say slow, she's not even cautious. She's very plotting. Everything she does, she never leaps without looking. She's figured everything out before she does anything. And Arminius is the exact opposite. He leaps without looking at all. So I think that they have a great, chemistry. And when we were talking about the characters, there was a sense of, if Arminius as a guy is this plotting, tactical guy in terms of battlefield tactics, how could he be so blind to what's going on with his very own relationship? How could he not know? And how many people in real life do we know like that are a genius in the boardroom but can't figure out how to make a relationship work? And it's just, he has a very childlike perception and juvenile perception of love and caring, and that I'm going to do this. I'm going to be a big grand gesture. So you have to want it. Doesn't matter why didn't you just talk to her about it? Like, have a discussion, So I love their characters and I love their relationship. And I feel like despite the grandiose situation they find themselves in, there's something for all of us to learn from their interactions.
Well, and I completely agree with you. And just kind of based on kind of how you answered that question, just the attention to detail and the kind of combing through these kind of plot elements with a fine-tooth comb seems like it, like you mentioned, it was, both kind of like stimulating, but it also must have just been mind-bending at times as well. And again, just sort of feeding into what I wanted to ask you next. I mean, obviously, I think society and human beings as a whole have been fascinated with Rome and its histories for decades, for centuries. There's no shortage of books, movies, television that will tell you, snippets and things that you need to know about the Roman Empire. But I guess I wanted to know, in your opinion, being that you are such a student of this, there must be certain elements that you see repeated time and time again in movies and TV where you're just like, that's just garbage. That's wrong. It's so Hollywood. And is there something with Dead Romans that you're kind of looking to help correct or revamp those preconceptions that certain people might have about Roman history?
There is one thing that always drives me crazy, but I understand completely why it's done, and I also love it, even though I know it's totally wrong. Roman legionaries didn't all wear the exact same thing. The uniforms weren't all the exact same. The reason they wore the red cloaks was so that they were identifiable as the unit. That's why. And there's also, and I've read different takes on this, that the shields of a legion, each legion had its own shield insignia. But I've also read that that's not true. So who knows? Like, that's the thing, is everybody's going to have their own take on it. But there is the biggest thing that always drives me crazy when you talk about Rome is that Rome is always painted as the bad guy and the oppressor and the horrible thing. Now, everything bad, that's what Rome is. Now, by today's standards, absolutely 100% correct. Like, horrible, horrible stuff. But at the time, they weren't any worse or better than anyone else. And
Right.
the German tribes and the way they handled slavery could be considered far more brutalizing and barbaric than what the Romans were doing at the same time. And another big thing that I feel doesn't get enough attention, and this is consistently backed up almost every time the Romans went anywhere, they always gave you an offer to join them first. Like if there was something you had that they needed for, they're like the Borg, you know, join us, don't fight, you're going to lose. Like we're going to win. So you might as well just join up. And the thing that made Rome so great was that they weren't Rome. The Roman legions were, there was the legion proper, but the legion structure was really just a massive conglomerate of all the things they'd found in other places that worked. And it's like they were never that, well, we don't do things that way, we make the world Rome. It's like, no, you've got really good swords, those would be really good for us. So tell you what we're going to do, you can join us, you get to make all of our swords and teach our blacksmiths how to make swords your way, and you're going to get lots of money for doing it because we're Roman, that's what we do. So they engaged just as much in economic warfare as they did anything else. And people have a conception that Rome was always the bigger player. And in fact, they weren't. Like if you go back to the Punic Wars, in the first Punic War, they were the underdog big time in going up against Carthage. And Rome would always take a look at what they're doing better than us. Let's steal it and make it our own, then improve on it and use it against them. So I've read this big breakdown about how obsessive they were about capturing Carthaginian ships. They didn't want them to burn. They wanted to catch them, capture them, bring them back to Rome, reverse engineer them, then make their own. And there was never we can build something better. It's like, no, we'll just steal what they're doing. If they're doing what works, we'll take it. Whereas the pop culture version of Rome is they roll in with the best of everything and they win all the time. They had terrible cavalry. The most of their cavalry were Gallic, were from Iberia. The sword, like the classic Roman sword, you know, why can I not think about it right now? Like the classic Roman short sword, the gladius, there you go, is Spanish. Like they took it from Spain. Like that's where they got it. It wasn't theirs. They stole it from somewhere else. And why did they take it? Because they noticed that when the Lusitanians were fighting in a shield wall, they had these little short swords. And when they would use them in their shield wall, they weren't hitting the guys around them. They're like, that's pretty smart. I think that's what we're going to do now. And so all of these classical Roman ideas were actually taken from all over the world. And they had some really fascinating aspects of the Roman legions where they realized that if they're trying to garrison Africa, the soldiers that they've got garrisoning there can't be from Africa, because then they're going to have sympathies with the people that are there. And if a revolt breaks out, you can't be trusting that they'll choose the right side. So what they would do is if you signed up to join the legions in Gaul, which a lot of German soldiers and a lot of Gallic soldiers were very eager to do, because you got a salary, you got food, you got equipment, and you got a pension. Huge deals. Like it was a union job. It was the best job you could get. So they signed up. And then if you signed up in Gaul, you didn't stay in Gaul. You went to Africa, or you went to Iberia, or you went to the UK. And there's all these archaeological dig sites with Africans in the northern parts of Northumbria guarding Hadrian's Wall, because they knew that they know where their bread is buttered. They're not going to side with the locals. They're going to side with Rome on this. And the Rome was so responsible for a cultural exchange across Europe. Were they good? That's up for debate. Were they bad? Again, what's good or bad when you're dealing with a world that is all bad? So those are the things that I think I would like people to understand more about Rome, is the complexities of the social nature that existed because of the time frame that the Roman Empire existed within, you know?
Right. No, and I think that's really interesting. I mean, certainly myself, I think I was one of those people who just was under maybe the false narrative that viewed Rome as this egotistical, prideful,
Oh, they
we're
are.
going to just
Absolutely.
roll in and but I think what you're saying is they were a little bit more utilitarian as far as it's like,
Yes.
listen, we don't want to come in and steamroll you. We will and we can, but
Yeah.
listen to this offer instead.
Yeah. 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 Very
Let's
much.
no,
The
and I think
the
that
Gallic Wars.
that's really interesting.
When you take a look at the Gallic Wars in particular, with Julius Caesar, he came in and was actually viewed at first by the Gauls as a savior, because when he came in, the Swabians and Germanic peoples were coming across the Rhine and butchering and enslaving and abducting all kinds of Gauls constantly. The Averni specifically were in a massive war with the Swabian peoples for generations until the Romans came. And we actually play on that in the story. There's a character who is a Gaul named Eppo, because he's an auxiliary. He's an officer in the auxilia, because almost all of the Roman cavalry were Gallic, because they had way better horses, they had way better cavalry techniques than the Romans did. And so we'll like that Borgish way of, we'll take your individuality and like bring it into our own, And so there's a line like in the story where you've got these three characters talking about how none of us are actually Roman, but we're all bleeding for the empire, and all of them have their very specific personal reasons why they're there. And Eppo, who is a character that inevitably just became me, like when Nick draws him, he's drawing me, is what he's doing, because he goes, I can feel like your assholeness in this character, because there's a line where he's like, why are you here? He goes, because I'm just here to kill Germans. Like, I don't care. I'll do it for anybody. But like my fathers, my uncles, all of them were killed at the hands of their soldiers. So I'm here to ensure that my children don't have to get killed by them. That's why I'm here. I'm not here for anything else. So, and there's a very pragmatic sense of people of that era, not just Romans, but I think that throughout history, the thing that has kept people alive is being adaptive to new situations and pragmatic about the situations that they find themselves in. It's like, it's not the best, but it's what we have, and this is what we'll work with. And that to
Yep.
me is the true human condition. Somebody back then, somebody today, somebody 10,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, the exact same thing. It's like, this is where I'm at. This is what I need to do. So this is what I will do, because I got mouths to feed. That's it.
Yep. Yep. No, and I completely, I think that's a really interesting kind of take on it. And also, just, well, if I can here, I want to, maybe get a little metaphysical with this next one, but just, especially since you mentioning the human condition, I saw a clip of you a few years back. You were being interviewed at a con, and the person that you were speaking with was talking to you about success. And basically sort of asked you, I think, point blank, do you view yourself as successful? And you kind of made a nice little metaphor, speaking like, when you're in fourth grade, you think when you get to eighth grade, you're going to just have the whole world figured out. And by the time you get there, you realize, maybe you don't. And it's kind of this kind of constantly like carrot and stick. You're running, you're coming back, you're running, you're coming back. It kind of reminded me of, and again, to get a little old and dusty here, but I think you may appreciate it. One of my favorite philosophers, Arthur Schopenhauer, he has a quote that says, "How insatiable a creature is man. Every satisfaction he attains lays the seeds of some new desire, so that there is no end to the wishes of each individual will." And I guess I wanted to ask you, I mean, this is a huge, huge accomplishment, in like a monster feather in your cap. So has Dead Romans allowed you to occupy some sort of temporary stasis of personal career happiness? Or do you still believe that we as humans in that human condition are forever running on that hedonic treadmill?
I think we are, and I know that I am. If I talked to me 20 years ago, they would have been blown away with the things that I've done and the things that I'm doing. But it was weird. It lasted a week. Like the feeling of, oh, I made it. I felt good for like a week. And then it's like, well, what are you going to do next? And the Soul, that movie Soul, the Pixar movie, is
Yeah.
love it. There's some people that have pointed out some issues and took umbrage with it, but it genuinely, like 100% hits on what you just talked about, because the main character in Soul has this obsession with performing with like his jazz icons, and then he does it, and then it's like, I did it, and it's like, what now? Will we do it again tomorrow? It's like,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel that that is one of the most profound things in a movie that goes over everyone's head. We're so obsessive with that thing that we want, getting to that new thing. And then once you get it, it is what it is. And it's funny you're bringing it up, because that is exactly what happens with Arminius in the story. And I'm not going to tell you when it happens or why it happens or what happens when he realizes it, but that is the like the nexus of this story. That's it in a nutshell. Is it what you wanted? Is it? And if you'd taken the time to think about what you wanted, would this have been what you'd gone for anyway? Would you do this again? Yeah, there's my personal goal with Dead Romans is to have it get me to another story, like to do more. And I've even talked about, this isn't like it. Like, this is ideally just the beginning of another journey. And I'm hopeful that a story like this will open up opportunities. Like, the goal is to do a Conan story. Like, that's always been the goal. Conan and the Silver Surfer. Those are like the two big benchmark characters for me. And if you've seen any interviews with me, I always talk about Conan and the Silver Surfer. Now, I'd love to do a Silver Surfer story and have multiple Silver Surfer pitches in the back of my head. And I would love to do something like that down the line. And I have other story ideas that I'm working on. In fact, the goal is when this story drops, by like the second month it's out, that I've got another pitch or two in the fire ready to go, so that while there's still the momentum from this book, I'm like, hey, I did this, but I also did this, so I can do something else. I really love the audio stuff, like doing audio dramas, and to be able to take a story and write it as an audio drama is something that I really like to do. I'm really passionate about Mud 79, which come March, it's funny that things are really going to start happening for the audio drama and the comic book at the exact same time. I'd love to do a Star Wars story, but it's Star Wars stories that I want to do, I don't know if they'd actually fly. Just because if you've listened to Mud, it's like Platoon meets Star Wars. And it's very boots on the ground. And maybe that could happen, because I never thought we'd get a show like Andor, which is exactly that. And it'd be nice to do something along those lines. And I've got like I don't even know if you could really call it like fantasy novel series that I'd like to do too, but I've been tinkering around with that one for about a year, just writing ideas down. And yeah, I'd like to do that too. There's all kinds of things. And everybody you talk to that writes, like, it's like musicians when they've got an album coming out and they're like, oh, this is the best thing that I've ever done. It's so good. And it's like, they finished that album a year before you got to hear it. I finished writing all the scripts in 2021. I was done. All the scripts. So I've just been waiting for it. So I've been waiting, like for me, it's like, finally, here we go. But it's way easier for me to sit down and write a page than it is for Nick to draw one, you know?
No, I definitely understand where you're coming from. And speaking too, I mean, I definitely want to talk about Mud 79 and about the Star Wars audio drama, because I know that you've said in the past that one of your major quips with Star Wars, I know that you have had kind of a lifelong obsession with the franchise, if I'm not mistaken. I think Return of the Jedi was the first foray of yours into the kind of, the original trilogy. I know that it's something that has heavily influenced you, but I've heard you mention how the kind of gritty or aggravating thing about Star Wars is it's all good, all bad. It's desert or it's ice. It's lush or it's like, it's this. And like you said, there aren't really any kind of boots on the ground, kind of like a Platoon style Star Wars story. So, I mean,
that's changing. And I think that they're recognizing it. And the issue that I had is like when you look at the Republic is always viewed as it's the best. It's so good. Everything is great. The Republic is so good. Da 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 da. But the Republic clearly had a lot of flaws because there was billions of people willing to revolt against it. So it couldn't have been all that great. There was rampant slavery. There was corruption like you wouldn't believe. The Republic wasn't great. And they talk a lot about that in the Clone Wars series. They address all these issues. And then they talked about it in Mandalorian. And there was that line, by any metric, the Empire was best. Healthcare, education, civic infrastructure. Look outside. Is it better today? Did you make it better? You didn't. And they touched on it again in the second season of Mandalorian, where as soon as the Republic fell, the criminal enterprise started taking things over, and you had all these duchies, these little viscounts, like controlling areas. And I wanted to talk about that when I started working on Mud 79. And I have brought up The Last Jedi repeatedly in terms of it being a big influence on Mud. And what's wild is and I have noticed that the people that like Mud 79 hate The Last Jedi. And it's sort of like that Rogue One. If you like Rogue One, you can't like The Last Jedi. First of all, I love all of it. As bad as it is, I still love it. And I think, and I will die on this hill, that The Last Jedi had some of the most brilliant concepts ever brought into Star Wars that were desperately needed. I just feel like you can sense some studio meddling inhibiting what were some brilliant ideas. And there's some hokiness and stuff like that, but my kids loved it. So who am I to dump on them? If they're loving it, good. They're loving something that I love, and I'm just going to shut my mouth. We already have Rebels, so I'm happy. Like, Rebels is as good as it gets in terms of Star Wars. But the one line, and Benicio del Toro has it, is like they're making, the same people are making weapons for the Republic and the First Order, the Blast Tech Corporation. So this is the thing, you want to talk about getting into the nitty gritty. When I was researching for it, like, the thing that I did when working on Mud 79 is I read all kinds of war memoirs, specifically about the Vietnam War, because I wanted to have that element involved in it. And there's this guy, Nick Brockhausen, who is a colorful character who says a lot of things that I don't really agree with, but I also haven't experienced the sheer unrelenting horrors that he has as a human being. So it's very difficult for me to sit here and pass judgment on somebody. And he joined the military because it was really his only option, wound up getting duped into joining the Special Forces. And he was Mac V SOG, which were, you dropped him in behind enemy lines, and this is your mission. Sometimes they go on things called a bright light, which is where if a ship goes down and they're behind the lines, and they call the regular infantry hatchet forces. So if a hatchet force gets cut off, you can't just send more hatchet force guys to go get them, because the Viet Cong that are going after them are not just the run-of-the-mill rank and file volunteer soldier. These are the best of the best, trained by the Soviets to track these guys down. So you send in the Special Forces. And he wrote these books, We Few, Whispers in the Tall Grass. And he talks about how all of these little elements that come into your psychology when you're spending that much time in a combat zone, the way animals will move in the woods, you can tell that they're moving from something or they're just moving around. The sound of gunfire, the way the gun will have like a double echo, you can tell how far away it is. You can tell what type of weapon that they're using. So when I was writing the story, and I'm writing a story about this guy who joined the Imperial Army when he was 16 years old because he didn't have any other options, and he didn't want to be a farmer. He didn't want to, he knew he wasn't good enough to be a pro Limmy player. This was his only way off the planet he was on that he hated. So he joined the army. And my father's a lifelong military guy, and he has is a much harder fellow than me. And he tells me very bluntly, he goes, you need to be able to identify the type of weapons that are being used against you, because then you can figure out who you're actually fighting, because different ammunition is used by different militaries. And even if there's two militaries in the same place, you'll know who they are by the way they're firing the weapon. Are they firing in bursts? Are they firing single shots? What type of soldiers are we using? How much trigger discipline do they have? The patterns of the shots, the way they're firing, all these coordinated things, a well-trained soldier is going to know. They're just going to know it. So if you're writing and you're trying to impart that you're writing a firsthand story, you also need to know it as the writer. So I had to like research the types of weapons that were used by different factions in the Star Wars universe. And the Blastech Corporation was making weapons for the Rebels and the Empire and the New Republic, and they are making so much money. And like Kuat drive yards are making engines for the Empire, for the Republic. They're making so that line in The Last Jedi, where he's like the same people making the same. It's true. And it's canon, and it's like expanded universe, and it's all there. And all you need to do is look. It's the same, like 20 companies making all of the stuff for everybody. Body armor, ships, speeders. These companies are selling to everybody. So they really are evil. And that's what you start to learn if you take the time to read up about fictional companies in a fictional universe.
They're the Lockheed Martin of the
Yeah. That's what it is. Blastech, the Blastech Corporation.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Taking a quick pivot here, because I know we've been speaking for a while, and I kind of wanted to delve, if I can, a little bit more into kind of just getting some insight and kind of learning a little bit about you and sort of your process and sort of, I mean, obviously you're meticulous when it comes to your research and your writing, that's to be sure. One thing I've heard you mention is how Howard Stern, understandably, you being, not only just a comic book writer, but also a radio personality as well. That certainly makes sense. And I know that you said that in Private Parts, Howard stresses the importance of eliciting a strong emotional response from the audience. And I guess I wanted to ask you, being where we are today with, like, obviously when Private Parts came out, social media didn't exist. It was a lot easier, I think, in some ways to create a genuine response, whether it be very, very good or very, very bad. It was easier to maybe polarize. And do you think that it is more difficult to elicit that same type of emotional response, or do you think that that's easier nowadays?
I think it's easier. And I think it's become dangerous. And even Howard Stern would say that it's become dangerous. Like, I'm still a huge Howard Stern fan because he has evolved with his audience, and the Howard Stern that existed, and he never denies it. He never tries to hide from the things that he had done in the past, that he even says, he goes, I wouldn't do that now. And he goes, I think it was really offsides and I shouldn't have done it, but I did do it. And I did it because that's the way things were then. And I would never do it again. And I've changed who I am. And there's a genuine realness to that. But I do find now that everything is geared to elicit a strong emotional response, and predominantly negative, because people react to a negative emotional stimulus much stronger. You go online and you see a news story, and it doesn't so much have anything to do with what's in the article, but the headline is something bombastic, designed to be, oh, can't believe this. I gotta read it. I gotta read it right now. I'm so angry. And it's like, you find that things that lean left and things that lean right, it's almost like left-leaning publications are writing towards conservative people that will see it and get mad and clutch their pearls, and then they'll read the article, not even taking anything in, maybe not even reading it, just reposting it, going, can't believe they're saying this. And then it happens on the opposite side too. And it's frustrating that there was a guy that I work with, and he's a producer, and he says that the world is a scale of 1 to 10, and the 1s and 2s and the 9s and 10s are controlling the conversation, even though the rest of us are the 3s to 8s. Where no one's listening to them. It's always
Yep.
on the other sides. And um, I don't want to get into like a specific argument, but I think that everybody does feel that they're being spoken over rather than spoken to. And these strong emotional reactions that generally speaking, focus on that side is wrong about everything, so screw them. It kills a conversation and it kills an exchange of ideas. And when I have a story like I got a message from somebody who was upset that I was doing a story that had anything to do with Rome because Rome is so evil, and they were never gonna support me or anything like that ever again. And in my head, I'm like, that's kind of sad. We could have a conversation about it and put things into context. A Captain Lorca on Star Trek Discovery, that's one of my all-time favorite scenes in a television show ever, when he says context is king. Because context is king. Context affects everything, because it's not so much what you're saying, but how you're saying it and why and when you're saying it. All these things matter. And I feel that anytime somebody is trying to shut down the conversation, that is the most dangerous and destructive thing you can possibly do. So getting a strong emotional reaction, I think, is great if that reaction engages somebody to converse and to talk and to resolve a situation. But if your provocation is only to shut somebody up and keep them from telling you how they feel, I think that's a real problem. Because I like with Dead Romans, the exchange of ideas and knowing where somebody is in an honest perspective, I think, is the most important thing. Talking and understanding and exchanging are the benchmarks of the human condition. And anybody that tries to stop that, I think, is doing a genuine disservice to everybody around them. And I feel it getting worse. We all have our moments where I feel it's getting worse, and then I feel it's getting better. And I got very frustrated when controversy is used as a marketing approach. And that is, I think, one of the worst things that we see happening. And you see it happening a lot. And it's bad because it puts people in these defensive shells, and then they find these toxic online communities that just serve as echo chambers for horrible thinking and horrible habits. And don't like it. Makes me upset. I'm on a slippery slope. I'm ready to go down.
No, but I think I understand where you're coming from, and I agree. It's, we used to get to used to be at a time, I think, where the left and right could meet somewhere in the middle and at least have a intelligent exchange of ideas. Whereas now it's more about reaffirming what you already choose or what you already believe to be correct. And you're so blind to another perspective that you just completely shut it out. I remember there's a guy named Sam Harris who I'm sorry. I was
No. I'm sorry. You keep going. I'm listening. I feel like I cut you off.
Oh no, I was just going to say there's a guy named Sam Harris who wrote a book, or sorry, an essay actually a few years ago, called "The Riddle of the Gun," and it was basically, he was arguing, instead of more gun control and taking away gun rights and limiting access to guns, he was essentially arguing that we should have more guns. There should be more guns in more people's hands. And when I read this, I was like, well, this sounds absolutely asinine. I thought I had my opinion made up. I was like, well, of course, I would never want a gun in my home. But after reading this, by no means was I going to go out and get an NRA card. But I was like, you know what? I thought about that in a way that I never would have had I not taken the opportunity to read this.
Nothing makes me happier, angrier than when somebody makes a brilliant argument about something I disagree with. And remember, I think it's Charles Pulliam Moore. He was a writer for IO9, which is one of my favorite pop culture websites to go to. And he did this big article about why it's never a good time for The Punisher. And I clicked on it because I love The Punisher. And I clicked on the article and I read it and I was angry. And then I'm like, he's so right. He's making all these incredibly valid points. And I'm getting angrier the more I read. But I'm not just angry at you for being right. I'm angry at myself for having no counter argument for the things that you're saying, because you're winning and I'm losing, and I know that I'm losing, but you're so right. Yeah, like that's one of my. I love being in that situation because I think that those situations are something we should be welcoming more, because that is growth in itself. That is growing. That is growing mentally and emotionally. That is growth, and it's important. I think we need to read more things that we disagree with. Do you remember? It was one of the first real viral Twitter feeds. Was that things might shit my dad says? I think is what it was called.
Yes.
And there was one of those tweets. It's so long ago. And it was like, your generation doesn't want news. They want to turn on the TV and have somebody shout their opinions back at them. And I remember being like, "Ooh, that's so true." And it sticks with me. And I know that it was this goofy Twitter feed from like 14, 15 years ago, but it's one of the truest statements ever. And I really, since seeing that, I realized I do that too. So I try to find things that I disagree with. So I think it's very important. And that's a good, strong emotional reaction that creates growth. I think that's important to do.
No, I agree with you. I think we as adults forget that learning doesn't stop once we leave school. And instead of getting bogged down in our opinions, it would do us well to pick up a book and have a conversation with someone who we might not agree with right off the hop.
Totally. Absolutely.
Now, I know we've been chatting for a bit here. So for these next few questions, I just want to kind of rhyme off some quick ones to you. You can give as much or as little context as you like. But for those people who have never ventured to Winnipeg, Manitoba, can you describe in as much or as little detail as you can what a bug juice Slurpee is and what it tastes like?
It's sweet. I don't really remember. Almost like I want to say it's got like a toffee texture, but like a sour toffee, if that makes any sense. And that is because Winnipeg is the Slurpee capital of the world, where they have more Slurpees per capita than any place on the planet is in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And when I was a stunt boy on the radio there, which is where the Fearless Fred name came from, I drank a Slurpee at every 7-Eleven in Winnipeg over 3.5 hours. And it was not the best of times, but it was a huge moment for me in my broadcasting career.
It doesn't sound like it would be the best of times.
No,
because from what I learned, that was when 7-Eleven had their 75th anniversary or something.
Yes, the 75th anniversary of 7-Eleven, and it was in Winnipeg. It was a big deal. I still have the watch that they gave me. I gave me the CEO of 7-Eleven Canada gave me a watch.
They gave you a watch. They should have paid for your dental activity for the next 10 years if after you drank 75 Slurpees in their establishments.
I had benefits, so they didn't need to pay for anything. But yeah, it was good. It was great. The morning show I was working with, BJ and Hal, I owe so much of my broadcasting career to them for giving me a shot. Like, I was the overnight kid, and I was just like, anything they'd ask me to do, I'd do. So yeah, and Power 97, it was great. It was a golden era for broadcasting.
No, and again, this kind of feeds into my next question here, and you've already kind of answered part of it. But being you're the first fellow Canadian that I've actually had the privilege of talking to on this segment. So I think, it's nice to be talking to someone who's kind of just up the road from me. I'm in London. I know you're in the GTA.
Yeah.
But I just kind of wanted to
my
to
show's syndicated at FM 96 in London, by the way. I'm on it in London. And FM 96.
That's literally right around the corner from me.
Yeah, it is.
Shout out
Great
FM 96.
I love
Shout out
station.
Andrea Dunn.
Yeah. Liz Gogol, Andrea Dunn. I love Liz Gogol. Yeah.
Oh God, yeah. So let's talk about. So you've already kind of spoken about BJ Burke and Hal Anderson. What does the name Richard McCarthy bring to mind?
He fired me, man. How did you know about all this stuff? Have I been running my mouth about this on the internet before? He was my boss in
I'm
Dryden, Ontario, and that was a station that I worked at a long time ago. And my first day on the job, he told me that I didn't have a very good voice and wasn't. He didn't say I wasn't talented. He just said I wasn't really talented, and that I should just accept that Dryden was it for me. Like that's as far as I was going to make it. You know what? Just accept it. You'll be way happier. And I remember being like, wow, maybe he's right. Who knows? Maybe he's right. So yeah, that was in Dryden, and yeah. So funny story. This is an aside. This is a very me making an ass of myself story. You have these moments where you get all these young broadcasters, radio students, and all that stuff will come to the radio station. You do a tour, right? And they come in, they do a tour, and then they ask questions. And I was with Joanne Wilder, who's like our midday announcer, and she's like the Queen Joe. And we're doing a crossover break, and there's like 30 broadcast students in this broadcast studio with us, and we're doing a break together. And then after we run this crossover break, one of the students is like, "Hey, you guys like just talk like normal people when you're on the air." I'm like, "Yeah, that's all we do. Talk like normal people. Neither one of us do the radio voice thing." And then some other student goes, "Have you ever worked with anyone that did that?" And Joanne goes into, because radio people love making fun of radio more than anything else, because we know all the reasons why radio is as bad as it is at times. And so we can call it out better than people that don't work in the business. And she starts going into like radio voice, and then I talk about Richard McCarthy. And I was like, Richard McCarthy, CKDR, AM 800, today's hits, yesterday's favorites. And I go on this thing and do the whole spiel. And then as I'm doing it in the back of the room, that's my dad. Richard McCarthy's daughter was in the room as I'm making fun of him. My former boss's daughter, the guy who fired me, his daughter is in there.
Oh.
It was awkward. Joanne still thinks it's the funniest thing that she's ever seen. She goes, because I saw you go from confident guy to the most, oh God, I've made a huge mistake instantly. And it didn't feel like that.
Oh my gosh. I was going to say egg on the face to the max with that one. I can only imagine.
Yeah. And I was like, how's your dad?
Oh
how's everybody at the old station?
Yeah. How's Dick doing?
Old Dick McCarthy. CKDR.
Oh my God. Oh my God. No, I think that's just absolutely hilarious. One thing I also wanted to ask you, I know we spoke about it when we first got on earlier, but I follow you on social. I see that you've got quite a green thumb to say the least. So I kill every plant and vegetable I try to grow. I mean, I've tried in vain to grow bell peppers, jalapenos, you name it. So I've got a nice south facing porch. It gets, sun for 90% of the day. What am I doing wrong?
Okay, so with peppers are tough. They really are tough. You got to make sure that your soil is properly conditioned. It's not too acidic. It's, not too alkaline, whatever. I don't know all the sciencey terms, but you just got to make sure that your soil is really well balanced for the peppers. And if you're growing your peppers in like a pot or something like that, you can get root rot if you're overwatering. And it's frustrating because if you've got drainage at the bottom of the pot, they'll get too dry too fast. So you've got to make sure that you're really balanced. Keep this topsoil damp and fill the bottom of the pot with pea gravel, and make sure that your soil isn't really peaty and holding in water, because then that promotes root rot, and then the plants will rot before they get to that point. I always say, throw them in the ground, put them in the ground, condition the soil, turn the soil. So you should turn the soil in the fall, turn the soil over, put the blood and bone meal in, put the plant food in, put the compost in, put the manure, sheep manure, by the way, that's the best.
Sheep manure, okay.
Turn the soil, And then what I like to do is after I turn the soil in the fall is I put landscaping cloth over it. And then that prevents weeds growing through, but it still allows all the winter melts to get into the soil. And then that allows the soil to stay healthy and get less, like, I don't want to say like consumed, but less degraded or depleted by weed growth and stuff like that. But you got to remember too that plants have symbiotic relationships with each other. So certain plants grow really well in the same plot. Like you don't need to divide everything. Certain plants grow good together. Like tomatoes and garlic grow really good together. Like they
Okay.
were meant to be. So you grow them together and then they are putting things back into the soil and taking things out of the soil, but they're each doing something different. So they work symbiotically together. Peppers can be frustrating because you've got to make sure that you've started them early. You've got to start them from seed in like March with a grow light and get them like before you put them in the ground, make sure you prune them so they got they're bushy. You want them to be bushy so they got lots of leaves because when you put them out, you got to like take them in their pots and put them outside to harden them off.
Mm-hmm.
Heard that term a lot, get them in and out so that they're used to being outside. And if they grow inside, the stalks tend to be really flimsy and they can snap when they're outside in the wind. So a little secret, when you've got them in front of your grow light, put an oscillating fan in front of them, and then they'll get used to bending and the stalks will get stronger. And so when you put them in the ground after hardening them off and dealing with the fan and making sure you're pruning them so they get lots of growth, um, they'll probably go into a bit of shock at first and it'll look like nothing's happening.
Okay.
And then all of a sudden they grow. That's all I got for you. That's all that I know.
That's all he knows, he says. This guy just gave a gardening 101.
Hold on
Ed
one
Lawrence
second.
would
Hold
be
on.
proud.
1 second. Hold on 1 second. I'm going to show you a book. Hold on.
Okay, perfect.
This.
Grow food.
This is the best gardening book that I have. How to Grow Food by Richard Gianfrancesco. And what's amazing about this book is that it goes through and it rates foods based on how easy they are to grow, how much you'll get, how well they store, what type of soil you need, where you need to plant them. And then it gives pruning advice. This is the book. I'm telling you, it's the gardening book. It's the best gardening book I've ever had. How to Grow Food by Richard Gianfrancesco. It's the best.
How to Grow Food. The
Yeah.
Aeneid of the gardening world.
Yeah. That's what you want.
Beautiful. Well, you know what, Fearless Fred? I feel like I have learned so much from you today, everything from Roman history to gardening tips. I've got one last question before I let you go, and I just simply want to know, is it better or more important to be a great writer or a great storyteller?
I don't know. I always say that I'm not a good writer. I'm a good storyteller. I say that all the time. My editor for my podcast, The Radio Play, who I always refer to as the contemptible harpy whenever I'm talking about her on the show, she always gets very mad at me when I say that I'm not a good writer. And she's like, "You're a great writer. You just don't like to focus on the writing. You focus too much on your story." So I love writing stories. I love it. But a good writer is good at taking that story and selling it. And that is what I'm horrible at. I can talk about the story. I get so stoked. I'm great on a show floor to selling books at a con. But when it comes to just sending an email with, "Here's my pitch, here's the 2 sentence breakdown," I'm terrible at it. Like, I'm really bad at that stuff. And when I was in English in high school doing like critical analysis of stories, I couldn't write a good essay about critical analysis. I just couldn't do it. But yet when I would sit down and talk to my teacher about what I wanted to do, there's like, "How come you can do this, but you can't just get it onto the paper?" I'm like, it's hard. It's too hard. It's easier just like, I know what the story is. I know what the motifs are. I know what the symbols are. I know what is being said and what is not being said by being said. I know all that stuff. I just putting it together in like an essay is hard, but I love writing stories. I think that Robin Hobb, I think, is like a phenomenal fantasy storyteller. And you take a look at her writing and compare it to some of these big heavy hitting fantasy writers, you could say that her writing is very like simplistic and all that, but her stories are so good. They're so good. I love the Farseer trilogy, and I'm stoked to see that adaptation coming out. I think it's IDW is doing it. I think IDW is doing the Assassin's Apprentice trilogy, which is amazing. If you've never read it and you want to read really cool, like not even high fantasy, but it does involve like dragons and magic and assassinations and all that stuff. It's cool. And how different schools of magic all hate each other. Like certain schools of magic are noble and certain schools of magic are, it's terrible. Why would you even do it? It should be outlawed. It's good. Robin Hobb. She's a fantastic writer, by the way.
I was going to say, I've got so many excellent takeaways from our conversation today. I'm going to have to hit Indigo and stock up for the new year, because I feel like I definitely need to digest everything that you're coming at me with today. But you know what? I feel like this is a great place for us to leave it today. Fred, again, thank you so much for your time in speaking with me. It was just such a great, great conversation that we got to have today. Dead Romans coming out this
End of March. Yeah.
This March, because this episode will air in the new year. So it technically is the future. So yes, Dead Romans this March. Everyone make sure to watch out for Mud79. You can follow Fred at fearless_Fred on Instagram. Thank you so much. And we look forward to Dead Romans and seeing everything that's in store for us down the road.
Me too, man.
Take care.
You too, brother.